I've changed the title a little bit because everything wasn't fitting in. So essentially, my work is divided into two areas. I just thought of introducing that a little bit. So, in the global scale, I examine various kinds of discourses and knowledge hegemonies that are turning this whole sustainability regime into a very top-down, techno-science-driven kind of an approach. And to counter that, I'm trying to understand how traditional knowledge embedded in various kinds of rituals, performances, can really help inform that science and technology. But at the local level, I also work intensely on threats and challenges and various kinds of crises, the intersection of climate change and developmental processes, also the nature of environmental degradation, ecosystem degradation, spatial transformation from urban to rural, from rural sort of protected areas to urban, and what kind of implications it has for various kinds of populations. So then there's kind of a major socio-spatial disjunctions that we see. And also knowledge action gaps that make sustainability challenges more acute than they really are. And it's because climate change impacts are quite rampant in most of the vulnerable socio-ecological systems around the world, including, of course, India. My major part of my work has been in two sort of sides of the country. One is in the eastern coasts along the Sundarbans or in the Sundarbans, and also the western coast in Mumbai and Western Ghats. So they're very different in nature, of course, despite being coastal areas. And that's what sort of I kind of try to understand that, despite being coastal areas, one is very urban, one is also sort of ecologically very fragile at the same time. This one is more, the eastern part is more rural in nature. So, so this is what I'm doing for the future, sort of at this point, talking about, I'm trying to understand various kinds of ecosystem governance and how they're, uh, you know, many ways in it's becoming more complex and so on. So that's not probably very um useful, but yeah. So we basically getting into the main part of our discussion today is in divided into three sections. The first section is where I explain how the knowledge and the kind of understanding that we have on sustainability, climate change, and how we should mitigate or adapt or be sustainable is governed by one kind of knowledge. And then we're talking or trying to understand how we can overcome the methodological challenges, because it's very easy to say that we are co-creating knowledge, we are doing this, we're doing that, but every discipline has a very different approach to knowledge production. Natural science is very different from social science, is very different from humanities. So how do we reconcile that methodological challenges? And also, finally, what do we do with this knowledge? Is there a use of this knowledge? Is there a use of this intangible environmental heritage where the users are? So essentially, the second and the third one is explained through case studies. So, so to begin with, how unsustainability is being produced, there are various, of course, drivers that produce sustainable or unsustainability. The major one being the way we govern ourselves. The major one is being the way we govern ecologies around urban areas, around rural areas, around transition areas, around fragile ecosystems, around conserved areas, and so on. So, so how did it happen, or how has it happened? If we go back even in the history of colonial forest management, we see that the colonial forest management was initiated in the 19th century, not for conservation purposes, to be honest. The first, I mean, the Indian Forest Act, 1871, was instituted for game. to ensure that the colonial uh, sort of masters had enough animals to kill and also enough trees for the railway sleepers and other kind of usage. So essentially, the whole idea of forest conservation in India, at least, as is anywhere else, has come through this utilitarian kind of perspective where the forest is not conserved for animals or for sort of so-called conservation purposes that we nowadays understand, but for a very different kind of perspective, which if we look at it, which alienated local communities, tribal communities, drove them away from the forests, all in the name of conservation, which still happens, which is still very much going on as much as we see. I mean, we just recently last year, I think, around RA colony in Mumbai, there was this whole drive for removing encroachment, what has been described as encroachment of the local tribal population, right, in the forest. So, so that has been the standard approach for most of the forest governance or conservation that we know of. It's very exclusionary. It's very kind of top down in a sense. Now, so as I was discussing, it's more kind of a knowledge which talks about technology and science and dominance of that science. And we define science from a very narrow lens. We don't talk about things like citizen science. We don't talk about experiential knowledge. We only talk about science which are produced in the universities, produced in the laboratories, which is, of course, valid forms of science. I'm not doubting that. But that does not mean that everything else is non-science or not scientific in that sense. So there is this entire binary created between scientific and unscientific, which is a real problem because the problematic statements of what is scientific and what is unscientific is extremely unclear in this, which led to alienating a very large population who were forest dwellers in this part in South Asia, and introduced the certain kind of conservation practices and processes, and and that really is the beginning of unsustainable practices as we see even today being practiced across scales, across spaces, and so on. So for that, it puts a very important question mark on our public policies and how the public policies are driven. So essentially, public policy is a product of public opinion, and how public opinion is formed is a kind of dominance that I was talking about. And if I go a little bit into the theory of it, we know about coercion is one, of course, and then there is hegemony as the other one. So essentially, this is kind of the structure that has led to a certain kind of public opinion also. And by public opinion, I really mean that consensus that has driven the kind of policies that we have pursued. So, sorry?
All public policies are driven by public opinion. It is not a vested interest and the public is disinterested.
Absolutely. But generally, the definition of a public policy, the way it's justified, is always through the electorate, right? So because we elect a body and they, as representative of people, develop those policies. So if we have to assume that there is a kind of direct link to what we do as a system, then that probably is how we develop that. But you're absolutely right, because more and more we see that that everywhere in the world that this kind of public opinions are really marginalized in the process of public policies. So here we have this kind of a nexus between public policy and the elite, and we're seeing increasingly a role of the market also, where there is public policies kind of aligning more towards technology and science markets, and how the market is kind of developing different kinds of solutions, different kind of products, different kinds of approaches, and providing us that, well, these are the ways and that we can achieve sustainability, achieve mitigation, and whereas behavioral change, politics, and role for locals is becoming more and more marginalized. So this is basically a little bit of an explanation for what hegemony really is. I'm sure I don't need to go through that, and how it works through superstructures and the base. So how these patterns are, no problem, reproduced through the means of production and the relations of production and the political societies and civil society. So it kind of creates the kind of environment which is conducive for a certain kind of public policy as opposed to a certain other kind of public policy. So and this is how we, of course, are producing that consensus and that hegemony. And so we probably hear about urban populations talking about sustainability, and with a very different kind of notion and a very different, through a very different kind of canon than when we talk about the rural populations who live close to the nature, who are forest dwellers. Now, interestingly enough, if you look at all these ecotourism facilities, very often locals actually describe the tourists from urban areas as intruders. So they are intruders in their space, and they are kind of destroying their spaces. They are kind of creating disturbances across their spaces and so on. So it's not always the case that we, and they particularly enjoy that intrusion. Now, from there, we come to a very physical and direct part of what it justifies. This kind of discourse, this kind of policy discourse, and how it kind of creates very different ideas in our minds about the existing sustainability solutions or existing sustainability approaches. So we all have heard about this green tag in everything, right? Right from a detergent to a clothesline brand, we see this whole idea of green. Now, you can see most of the green tags are false. Most of the green tags, there have been enough number of studies which actually have uncovered that all these green claims, there are about more than almost 5,000 brands were surveyed, and 95% were found to be greenwashing. There was nothing green in there. Just by saying that we are green doesn't make you green, right? So that's a kind of a business strategy adopted. And that also, but then that actually has an impact on us. It actually, wherever we see green, we think, okay, let's buy that. It actually changes consumer behavior. That, but on the other extent, extreme rather, we are actually looking globally at very physical conflicts between different kinds of forest dwellers, different kinds of, and the state or the corporations. So if we look at this, this is adapted from a database called Environmental Justice Atlas, EJ Atlas. Now, EJ Atlas from 2012 started mapping all the cases of environmental conflicts around the world. And there are 4,137 cases in these 12 years recorded. Which two countries top the list? India and the US. So in India, there are about 400 cases reported. And in the US, there are about 400 cases reported. And you can see that they're from all areas like tourism, like conservation, like nuclear, like waste management, industries, infrastructure, biomass and land use, energy and climate. So it seems that there is a clash of values, a clash of meanings between the policies and the way we are trying to conserve and develop at the same time, and actually what is exactly happening to people. So if you look at this, it looks very nice, it looks very fresh, it looks very hopeful, whereas this doesn't. Yes. Yes. The environmental conflict is described as a conflict between two parties, whether it could be state or it could be state and corporation and the local populations or a group of people who feel that this whatever has been is being done. Let's say in case of mining or in the case of nuclear, there would be one party who would not want to sort of go along with that, whereas the state or the corporation or the nexus between them would want to go ahead with that. So most of the cases, if you look at in India, for example, in the NGT and the National Green Tribunal. And the role of National Green Tribunal has, of course, been marginalized over the years. So there are various ways that people resist. That could be through litigations, could be through movements, could be through different kinds of other processes. But something that has been reported and there are parameters that the atlas describes as. So what are their parameter for inclusion of that particular conflict as one? So it could be police case, it could be litigation, it could be protests of various magnitudes and so on. Also, you at the same time, I'm trying to put you the contrasts one against the other. So if you look at these kind of things and imagine that that this is what the business really wants us to believe, that they're all green, they're all very nice, they're all protecting the environment. Something as strange as greener miles. So you're still traveling by a car, you're still using a car, you're still burning fossil fuel, but you project that as a virtuous kind of, I mean, Ryanair, for example. So but then we come to even more devious and dubious kind of claims like the net zero claim, and how that discourse creates hope out of something which is not even scientifically proven, not even scientifically validated. So essentially it is kind of a magic solution. Everywhere you will hear that there is net zero and every company is going net zero, every corporation, large corporation is going net zero. It creates hope in the minds of the consumers that this is what is the future. A very interesting book by Naomi Klein called Disaster Capitalism. Many of you probably have heard about that. So what really is net zero? I mean, just wanted to give you a glimpse of the science so that it kind of you can separate the science and the claims and the discourse differently. So net zero is basically when you are trying to burn a biomass such as wood and fast growing energy crops and then trapping that carbon in the soil. So you are basically trying to capture the carbon from power station chimneys and trying to trap that in the soil so that it enriches the soil. So and they're also exploring something like direct air capture on or things like by geoengineering or sulfur injections in the atmosphere to that extent. But the kind of land needed for that is about 80% of the land already under cultivation. So are we talking about a debate against food production because the land that is under cultivation is for food? And we're talking about the level of bioenergy that will demand that kind of land. We don't have that kind of land, and also the technology that we're talking about is not even developed. So we've not had one single successful case study of net zero yet in the world. Yet we are still talking about net zero as the grand magic solution. Now, the reason why they are favorites for mega corporations, because first of all, they're strategically vague. They're extremely vague. You wouldn't ever see a kind of scientific paper or scientific evidence to support their claims. You wouldn't see you would only see the kind of opportunities that come along. So essentially, this favors the state, this favors the corporations, this favors business, and so on and so forth. But it doesn't really make any real world change. In fact, net zero for one is so interesting that it basically is an offsetting mechanism. It is not reduction in any sense of the word. It doesn't reduce, it offsets. So I'm sure you know the difference between offsetting and direct reduction. So that is where we are at. So there is one sort of discourses which looks like very promising, very attractive. On the other hand, we have something which is science and science-based, and which clearly tells us that this is not working, this has not worked. Even with all this talk about energy transition or moving towards green energy, if you look at the graph, the installations, let's say solar or wind or anything of that sort, they have not replaced traditional energy use. They have been just added on top of the existing use, which has also been increasing over the years. So nothing has been reduced. If you look at the greenhouse gas emission for year 2023, which is the largest in history, is about 40 MT. We need to be at 16 MT a year by 2030 if we are talking about anything about mitigating climate change. So you can imagine from coming down from 40 to 16 is a task. But we are still talking about various kinds of magic solutions. My problem is that I think it's a more of an ontological problem. It's more a problem with the way we govern than it is with with this kind of solutions. And there are different kinds of values and meanings which different communities come from, different science streams of science come from, policy actors come from. So there are these very different kinds of ontologies which I think we need to recognize, and we need to understand those differences, and we need to create a certain kind of paradigm where most of these can be accommodated. So we've just talked about this and how the origin and the evolution and validation of different kinds of epistemological approaches and power structures evolve and validate one kind of epistemologies over the others. However, I would still say that it's a very Western kind of canon, because epistemology is in itself by definition a very Western approach, or a very institutionally academic approach. We don't know any other alternative, to be honest, do we? Whenever we use the word epistemology, we still refer to that process of knowing, and that process of knowing is very strongly developed in the universities or in the academic institutions. It's not developed by the community in any case. So there is this case study which I wanted to share with you. It's a very interesting case study, which I did my research on between 2002 and 2007 about increase in leopard attacks in the city of Mumbai. Now there are a lot of leopards attacking, leopard attacks happening around Sanjay Gandhi National Park, or Borivali National Park is what we call it locally, colloquially. So, so what happened is that there was a biological hypothesis, and the biological hypothesis very clearly indicated or said that there is a degradation of habitat and prey base, there was an overpopulation of leopards beyond carrying capacity, and most importantly, increased human interference in the forest. Now, as with our courts, the courts immediately said that remove all human settlements inside the forest, all the tribal settlements, because the numbers are increasing, the attack numbers were increasing. Now, what were the evidence? The evidence were very clear. Again, for the biological hypothesis to and they produced evidence from camera traps, and they showed that leopards were moving around human habitations. They were moving around uh, people, and the sites of attacks were also self-explanatory in a sense. So the policy action was the state moved court to evict the settlements, and they said that okay, we'll evict the settlements and there will be no attacks. Now, a very simple question somebody asked, that these people have been living there for last 200 years. There was no attack. So why suddenly now? What really changed? And that took a long time to understand. So because leopards have lived with very close vicinity of humans for a very long time, and they're fringe forest animals. They're not even deep forest animals. So what really happened? So we found that when we were conducting the interviews, we found that a lot of locals, a lot of older people said that these are not our leopards. So we were flummoxed. We thought, what did he mean by these are not our leopards? What is, I mean, they are an our leopard? What is the difference between allocation of leopards in some senses? So, and then we started exploring that, and we realized that there was a leopard rescue center in the Sanjay Gandhi National Park. Leopards injured from all over Western Ghats and Western region were brought in for treatment. And when they were treated and when they were fit, they were just released in that forest. Because who will take the leopard back to its original habitat or original forest where it came from? So there is a forest, release the leopard in that forest. Big deal. And this is a leopard, habitat anyway. So, but again, leopards being extremely territorial animals, and there was, I mean, like female leopard, along with its cubs, traveled 90 kilometers from Sanjay Gandhi National Park to its actual habitat, at forest where it came from. So, of course, we realized then that the problem was with the translocated leopards, and what the people were talking about, not our leopard, meant that these are translocated leopards, leopards who were released in the forest. So that actually worked, I mean, both ways, in a sense that we produced that evidence. We told the forest department that this is not going to solve your problem until and unless you stop sort of releasing leopards from wherever. And also on top, they created a safari. And the safari was with tigers and lions. So they would keep the tigers and lions in the cages. They will release it every day in the morning. Poor, tired, bored souls. They would just roam about, and there would be cars, there would be safari jeeps going on. And they're, of course, given meat. They didn't have to sort of go for a kill. No forest in India has tigers and leopard, tiger, leopard, and lions living together. No forest in India. So this is actually a disaster, because they can send, I mean, the ability to smell is very, very high in these animals. So they can smell the other species. So there is bound to have psychological problems. And that's what happened, because they could smell the meat being offered to the tigers and the lions who were in confinement, and just released for as show pieces kind of thing. So these were the kind of problems people pointed out repeatedly, that don't develop a safari here, because there are already wild leopards, there are captive leopards, then there you've got some tigers in from somewhere, you've got some lions from somewhere, and then you're creating an entire mess. Sorry? Yeah. So there are all kinds of, and this is what we feel, that we can control everything, can control every ecosystem, we can control animal behavior and so on. So these are very complex reasons why the attacks increased, and it was to do with the way it was governed, and not because of any kind of inherent problem with the with the leopards as such, or with the human population at all. because the humans, I mean, we conducted surveys village after villages, and they said, yeah, we know that the leopards are there. They have a mechanism of even feeding the leopard in the time of monsoon when it becomes difficult for the leopard to hunt. So they leave meat at very strategic points where they have shrines called Vagoba shrines. So they leave those kind of things so that the leopard doesn't, kill their um, cattle and chickens and so on and the poultry. So, so that's what the conclusion really was, that not to relocate leopards indiscriminately like that. And it worked. 2007 or 8 onwards, no attacks. So the understanding of traditional knowledge about the forest is kind of marginalized in forest governance and ecosystem conservation and species conservation. But the fact that they have been living there for 200 years and they have developed that knowledge actually can be a very productive source of effective governance of those ecosystems, which we tend to disregard completely. So there was the other another example of how community-based ecosystem governance has really worked well in the through a deity, forest deity called Bon Bibi, which means that it's the goddess of the forest. But if you look at it, it's a very hybrid, a hybrid between Islam and Hinduism. Now, Islam would never sort of worship a goddess, but here they do. Hindus would never accept a goddess with a sort of appendage of Bibi, which is very Islam kind of sounding. But there is this whole ecological process through which this beatification probably has been born, and it has been born out of necessity and also out of equitably sharing the forest resources. So what we see here is that ethical and moral lessons that only the marginal will have access or should have access to the forest produce, whether it's honey, whether it's fish, whether it's crab, whether it is wood. So the priority has to be given to the marginal and those who need it the most. Also that you will not take anything beyond what you need from the forest. So this process has worked successfully for over again 200 years. This has kept the forest sustainable. This has sort of, people have managed, people have lived with this kind of arrangement. So even geographically speaking, because I'm a geographer, and when we were mapping through GIS, these little shrines, we realized that the shrines are located in such points in the forest, in the national park forest, which actually form a boundary for the locals, which form an kind of an invisible boundary for the locals, and they know every time they go there and they see that last shrine, they would say that this is up to which we need to or we are allowed to be. And this is entirely community governed. There is no forest department, there is no forest patrol, because you really can't have forest patrol here because the region has about 4,000 square kilometers of water bodies. Crisscrossing the entire region is about 15,000 square kilometers, of which 60% is in Bangladesh, 40% is in India. But through that level of riverine kind of labyrinth of rivers and so on, you really can't patrol. It's impossible to patrol. So people had developed their own mechanisms, and mechanisms through, let's say, even a hybrid new religion or a deity which is revered across even Christians, because there's a very, sizable Christian population. So Christians, Hindus, Muslims, all would pray the same deity and the goddess, and also create a boundary for themselves, not to cross that boundary. And so what by these examples, what I was trying to sort of emphasize on is that we need to reimagine different kinds of understanding that we have, and we need to produce nature and these stories together, I mean, kind of get these stories together and produce kind of, a new knowledge paradigm, if I may say so, that needs to be uh, applied or employed in, I mean, from range of areas, from ecosystem governance to even developing technologies. So this is what I mean by co-creating sustainability policies and governance. Now, and this is a kind of structure. This is the Bonbibi's shrine. This is the Vaghova shrine in Western Ghats from Junnar. Junnar is near Pune. So this is how we can, I mean, this kind of a very kind of initial framework, I might say, but there is this whole understanding of ethics and morality. Then there is an understanding of space, boundary, and sharing the resources. Then there is also the kind of knowledge, actual knowledge of when to go, where to go, what to do, what not to do within the forested areas, and so on. So this could actually, bring in all these or reconcile various kinds of disciplinary conflicts that we've had in forest governance. A more kind of, structured framework could look like this. And we're not talking about marginalizing any form of knowledge. We're not talking about marginalizing either technology or science or Western knowledge or industry or markets, but trying to create a framework where we would be working together and co-creating knowledge. It's easier said than done because it's very political, highly political as a project, but that probably could actually produce some interesting effective processes. Some of I mean, I probably had discussed this with some of you. Why? Because we didn't co-create knowledge. So scientific solutions like these, like solar cookers, failed miserably because it did not align with the local recipes. People love their food. Food anthropology is major subject. So people love their food and they know they have certain kind of utensils where they cook that food. That did not work with the solar cookers that were heavily subsidized. The government put in millions of, billion, not even millions, but billions of rupees that were given free of cost to the women, but it didn't work. It didn't work because the back-end research was never done. The technology was never informed by the cultural practices, the social practices that people already had. So essentially, this is the iconic image that we took. They're trying to, even after buying a new pressure cooker, they're trying to use it in this. And this woman was all over the place, how to use it, what to do with this contraption. She didn't have any clue. So you can see that it was very nicely kind of unpacked and that she's trying to use it. And she has a new pressure cooker also, but she has no idea how her own recipes would be cooked, what time will it take, how much, just simple things like how much water you need to put in there in this and so on and so forth. So for her, it was, I mean, and we told her that, you can probably, just sit like that, because this is actually how she was sitting in front of that contraption. So what I'm trying to say is that, you need that knowledge, you need that understanding, you need to co-create, otherwise, all this, so utensils was one problem, recipes were the other problem, taste, despite the fact that it's subjective, but, of course, people go by the taste of food. I mean, we all do, right? So we can't say that for us, taste is very important, for them, it's not. So they can eat anything and everything. So these are kind of things that brings back, emphasizes the importance of creating the kind of paradigm, new paradigm, or kind of co-creating a knowledge paradigm, which would inform science, inform technology, inform markets, inform policies, and that has to be in every sphere of ecosystem governance, whether we're talking about climate change mitigation, we're talking about adaptation, we are talking about industrial development. In fact, I was doing a research on accidents. in the uh, in NH44. NH44 is one that connects Delhi to Chandigarh. So there were a lot of accidents happening after this huge 6-lane, 7-lane, 8-lane highway was produced. The accidents were happening not because people were careless or not because it was completely because the highway cut across their fields in one side and the houses on the other side. So they have been crossing that road for again hundreds of years. That this part from coming from this part to that part, there was no crossings created for humans ever. So it was all for designed for cars and high speed vehicles. So there were neither underpasses at strategic locations nor over bridges for people to cross. And why would they? Because they were crossing regularly, like just I mean coming from this side to the other side. Now suddenly there was this highway which cut across through the villages and segregated the village into two parts, one side here and one side there, and of course people still needed to cross because they still needed to go from their houses to their fields. So this part which I mentioned here is a little more uh, methodological, but I still thought that when we talk about co-creating knowledge, it's not as easy as it sounds like. So there are various kinds of methodological challenges. As I was talking about, that the various disciplines have very different methods to produce knowledge. So there is this one paradigm which we now call as post-normal science, and post-normal science is uh, sort of different from normal science, which was postulated by Kuhn. So post-normal science was developed in the 90s, and for four very specific situations. One is when facts are uncertain, because the science of climate change or sustainability is still in its nascent stages. We don't know a great deal. We have still limitation on our knowledge, and we realize that every time. When the values are in dispute, where they're talking about financial values, social values, cultural values, and so on, the stakes are very, very high, and also where the decisions are really urgent, because what we do now will shape the future of the humanity, let's say 20, 30, 40 years hence. And now we really don't have that luxury, because we realize that we've already crossed 1.3 degrees of temperature increase in terms of climate change impacts. And till 30, we can only go up to 2 degrees. And that's what I mean, there's a global consensus that only up to 2 degrees we can allow, because other than that, 40% of the world's coastal areas will anyway submerge. And we don't have time. So that cutoff date was 2030, now it has been extended to 2040. So, and these impacts are real, very much real. If you look at the glaciers, if you look at the Himalayan ice cover, if you look at the kind of loss that we've already had, it is quite significant. We all talk about how hot it has become. Do we ever imagine that it's for a reason? So this is one where we are talking about how we can still take into consideration the uncertainty, because the science, we can't wait for science to come up with exact data, exact kind of information, exact kind of facts. But we still have to act now. So this is how the kind of those kind of differences in terms of ontologies and epistemologies can be reconciled. It seems that we have to bring out these stories, we have to value the stories from the people that have these stories to share, and the stories have knowledge. And that's what we need to produce, that's what we need to understand. And that is where our essential work should start from. Anyway, a lot of people say that it's decolonial thinking. I wouldn't claim that, because it's very easy to claim that it's decolonial, but I don't even know what a decolonial way of thinking really is, because our entire training, our entire understanding has been shaped by a certain kind of colonial. We are sitting in a university which is very colonial in structure, right, in the first place. So the design principles could be, or seems to be, that we need to open up and legitimize various kinds of epistemologies, even within the Western understanding of what we know about or understand by the word epistemology, and bring in knowledge from various different parts. Also, use ethics and morality as much as instruments within the discourse as well as within the policy, because that's not uh, used or formalized as instruments and policies, but there's kind of increasing amount of work that focuses on or that describes how that can be extremely effective in designing sustainable kind of solutions. And in the end, it is not contradictory. None of the knowledge is really contradictory, as we saw in the case of leopards. It's complementary, and different kinds of knowledges can come together. The heritages can inform us. It uses soft values as much as hard facts, and uses local knowledge, citizen science, and other informal ways of knowing into the policy space. So good. So that's what I would sort of finish by saying, that this is really a complementary way of knowing that we need to evolve. And I think we need a lot more empirical evidence for that. We need a lot more case studies for that. And I think if we produce those, if we channelize our energies towards producing those kind of evidences, it will only benefit us in the long run. Thank you so much. Thanks a lot.
Very interesting. And I'm just trying to sort of maybe push you to articulate a little bit what you mean by alternative epistemologies. Because you started by talking, of course, about how our current understanding of epistemology is very rooted in a kind of particular way and process of thinking, rooted in formal university setting. And then we talked about the value of traditional knowledge. You also said, I mean, and maybe these are my words, we also don't need to romanticize indigenous knowledge. There's a value to this. But then you also talked about the sort of impending climate crisis, because of which we don't have the time for exact scientific data. So then I'm trying to understand, what do we, are we thinking about rethinking the meaning of epistemology as we understand it, which sort of includes traditional knowledge till the time that we can actually have the time to do, kind of scientific data and gather it relating to the climate crisis, or is this a completely alternative epistemology that you are trying to do? I mean, what exactly?
Thank you for that question, and that's a crisis that I also would often in my mind, in my work, try to reconcile with. You're right. The idea of epistemology is very much rooted into what we know as, and what we've all studied probably. We're not talking, I mean, when we're talking about alternative epistemologies, and still within that framework, we are using, or we're trying to use different ways of knowing that probably the communities engage in or have engaged in over the years. That could be experiential knowledge, which is one, of course, the way they have, or their sort of experiments that they have conducted, which we don't know, because these are sort of, when we know about in vivo and in vitro, but when we are talking about in vivo, and that in vivo is a landscape like Western Ghats, or a landscape like the Sundarbans, they probably have conducted their own experiments and they've failed, or they've succeeded in some or the others. So we really don't, that's what I said, that we really don't have a framework that defines this. In the want of any better kind of explanation, I would use that term, sort of diverse epistemologies. So because I mean, there is no other term that probably we can use, and we still have a broader understanding for very diverse academic audience from all over the world. So that's one. And the second question is that the uncertainty that you talked about. Yes, it is uncertain, but what can we do in case of, I mean, we are not trying to say that we are using or we should use traditional knowledge only up to the point where the scientific data is not there. Of course not, because uh, in many cases we are actually duplicating the scientific data. We are actually producing duplicate data for which there is already evidence. In many cases that's the case. So we are basically not trying to say that, well, that there is only a kind of a use of this traditional knowledge only up to the time when the science that we know produces that knowledge. It's more like the government of India's the renewable energy process, right? Because in the renewable energy installations, they say that only up to the time that we are not providing grid connectivity to all these remote areas, we can depend on renewable energies. But once the grid comes in, the renewable energies are completely defunct, despite all the investments made. Now that's very strange, because it should have been the other way around, isn't it? The reason the reason is renewable energy installations are expensive, more expensive. Generation per unit wise, unit per unit cost of generating electricity is higher in renewable energy, whether there's a solar or wind, compared to the main grid connectivity, which is thermal. So of course, when the grid comes in, people wouldn't want to pay. Or why should they? I mean, they would of course want to pay a lower rate of electricity for electricity, right? What we needed to do is to create a feed-in tariff, which is an economic mechanism. So you all sort of get the electricity that's produced from various different sources, send it to the grid distributes it, and there's one uniform price. As simple as that, but which we've not been able to develop. So what I'm saying, or what I'm kind of trying to emphasize here is that first of all, we don't need to duplicate knowledge that's already there. We don't need to duplicate evidence, but simple things on what we can do till the time there. I mean, there's uncertainty, of course, but what are the zero risk kind of activities? The zero risk kind of activities would be to reduce consumption, as simple as that, isn't it? So, and that's ethical, that's moral, which is where I go back. So the best that we can do is to reduce consumption, rationalize consumption, rationalize production processes and so on. That will anyway reduce the emissions. I mean, now we are only increasing emissions from all sides. We look at every possible area we are increasing emissions. We have increased from 33 in 2020 to 40 MT of greenhouse gases in 2024. So from 33, we've gone to 40 in just 4 years' time. So if we say that we are going to reduce consumption, that will not really make business sense probably, but that will make a lot of environmental sense, wouldn't it? So these are simple things, and we really don't need all this fancy geoengineering kind of processes to achieve what we can just do by rationalizing our consumptions. And that's just one small example. Yes, please.
What do you see as the role of teaching institutions like the one we are now in this kind of situation? You mentioned, I think, several times the importance of telling stories.
Yes.
Is that a kind of responsibility for academic institutions to find this knowledge and to create the stories that get influenced later?
I think so, because I think stories, because in my previous career, the first career I was a journalist, I put a lot of emphasis on stories. And the stories are what make people understand complex situations much more easily. So when we are and case studies do that. So essentially, when we use a case study that's narrating a story or narrating a very you know unique story where all these kind of complexities are embedded, and it produces a certain kind of understanding in the minds of people. So even I think recently enough, Deepesh Chakrabarty also had written about this importance of stories and stories in climate change and stories about climate change. Even Amitabh Ghosh has been writing this, I mean, arguing for the same thing, that we need to tell the stories, different kinds of stories from different parts of the world, and bring that on the table and share that, because whenever we are getting bogged down into all these kind of academic jargon and nitty-gritties and so on and so forth, the simple basic message and the stories get, I mean, they're lost. So I really think that's a very important tool for teaching. For somebody like me, I'll always use those little stories, the ones that I even use for the leopards or for the solar cookers. And in fact, there's a very interesting story that I narrate to my students in Rajasthan. They had they were walking a long distance for collecting water. So there was this electric well dug up in their village, and it was like made water available so easily for women. But even then, women were absolutely livid. They didn't want that.
It was in the news also because and it was a community thing. They could talk. It was a
Exactly. They could get away from the Middle East. They said that was our leisure. That was the time that we could share our stories. That kind of. And now they had to be forced into housework or work for the men more intensely at home, because they said, Abhita, water is available here. What is the problem? Just go and get water. And all these women were kind of, struggling to cope with this new work pressure. They actually preferred walking. They said that this is the only time that we can get away from home. We can have some peace and quiet amongst ourselves, and we can discuss our problems away from these menacing men. And then we come back, and it's this kind of time well spent. No, it's not a danger in a sense that that's the reality of this village. Exactly. So that's where we need to understand there are multiple realities, right? So this is a whole concept which was created from psychology in the 40s of multiple realities, right? And that was then used in anthropology, very much talking about, I mean, there can be one truth, but there can be multiple realities, right? So this was the reality of that particular village, but without improving upon that reality, or without addressing that reality, we really couldn't take away their aim and their freedom and their uh, you know
So as a policymaker, you go and understand this way and then understand it. Electric wells should not be in the earth. And this space to talk. But imagine policy go out beyond this village.
absolutely.
There has to be a way to create the well in the environment.
So if you absolutely, so if we
Not really ideas,
no, it wouldn't be, but we can speak to at least the women and kind of locate situate that at a place where they would want it to be, and prioritize their sort of positions, take feedback from them, and to kind of understand where it should be. I mean, not directly in probably within the village or in the sort of, but a little distance away. Maybe some other points where maybe even have one for three villages combined, some strategic location where all women from all different kind of three or four villages can come. That would actually make a lot of economic sense in that case, right? So it would not necessitate like five wells to be dug in five different places, but one. And where you could use science to understand where the water levels or the water table is the best, and you can actually have that there. And you really don't need to kind of, go to every village and get one. So that could be a political decision. But again, we also need to kind of respect these kind of realities, which we know that there are, these different kinds of realities. So when we sort of learn that, and when we realize that it has actually ruined their, social spaces, we were quite upset in a sense, but we couldn't do anything of that there as much. So yeah, each case provides us a new learning kind of, you know, new lessons, and those lessons, I think, kind of help us create this kind of so here, if we see this, there is a kind of importance of community and civic science, citizen science, collegial, DIY, everything. So it's kind of, putting that framework together in a way that there is main science, the kind of the science that we know, as well as there are these kind of people science as well. And this kind of importance of citizen science in dealing with climate change or in dealing with everyday sustainable behavior is very important. It seems to me that it is. I mean, what is passed on in the name of circular economy is what? Recycle and reuse. That's it. We've been probably doing that for a very long time anyway. So, I mean, I still remember my grandmother would preserve any glass jar that, would come in a jam, or Horlicks or something of that sort, and then they will put biscuits in that after it was over, and they would never throw it off. That has a fashionable name that we call it circular economy these days, but that has been practiced in every society. In fact, I've asked this in Germany, I've asked this in the UK, I've asked this everywhere. I've kind of taught, and everywhere people have said, yes, our grandmother used to do that regularly. And they never threw things indiscriminately. They never sort of consumed as much as we do today. They never generated as much waste also. But the kind of waste we are generating these days is staggering. Even in India, the food waste is among the highest nowadays. I mean, of course, the US tops the chart. If we go by the standard US consumption, we would need 6 Earths to produce that. Yeah. The kind of resources. Yes, please.
Share something very quick. Friend of ours, a young son who was born water, and he did a study that Ahmedabad population created the riverfront. And they took away so many trees, they said
Thank you
they
so
plant
much.
new trees and the birds will come back. But they planted new trees, but the birds never came back. So I feel there is a big disconnect between the academia, the research, the citizen sentiments, and the municipality in its work. Because of this disconnect, all these things are happening.
Absolutely, and that we academics are also responsible for increasing that discussion to some extent, because of our complex ways of putting things out there. We don't really narrate these stories, simple stories where complex things will be simplified, but we keep making things more and more complex, unnecessarily complex, where things aren't or things shouldn't be.
One of the reasons for that is that they mentioned this whole question of women water. There's so much experience in this, and the entire lesson of the last 30, 40 years government futures put women in charge.
Yeah.
That was the basic thing.
Absolutely.
But the problem has been that all the experience in the 30 years in locating water resources, where they would not only be safeguarded, they would respect local needs, has been lost. There are a number of stories that every time we begin to be engaged. So that's why I was asking you, where are these experiences exposed to directly? In that rather important experience directly related to the cycle of water, the group that was working was told after a so-called success story, that's the end.
Yeah.
Whereas the academic institution said, no, this is the beginning. how do we document what we've done and how do we share it? But there's no support from any institution to documentation and share.
Which is actually one reason why I think that I mean academics and scientists should also be communicators, because I realized that because I was a journalist and I keep writing for the popular media, so-called the mainstream media, and in different languages. So it's not only that I write academic papers or I write books and stuff which we have to do, but I also spend a lot of time and energy in writing in the mainstream media, and whether all the local languages that I know or the vernacular languages I know, including English, of course. So there was this whole sort of debate over climate change when we were around 2009, where then there was Copenhagen, and then we were trying to understand why can't scientists make complex things simpler. It wasn't up to any journalist, or because that was too complex, but they could actually do that, but for that they needed to communicate directly to an audience, and these kind of stories, bring out these kind of stories, because there's a very limited, very narrow kind of space which we used currently for sharing these stories. And I'm absolutely in agreement with you that, I mean, we talked about ecofeminism for a very long time, but we have never practiced it in essence. And we know that ecofeminism could have been a very successful ecological restoration process. I mean, despite being the theory, there being the theories, despite being examples like these. Even I think in Rajasthan, when the Tarun Bharat wanted to organize the sort of excavate the water channels and reintroduce traditional knowledge and use that was successful, but then that again was headed by women in those villages across this northern Rajasthan, this part of northern Rajasthan. Yes.
That water, availability of water, availability of sanitation and all, that will also reduce sexual assaults against women. So that's another
Side of the story. So there are very, very different part. Exactly. Absolutely. So that's, I mean, that's what, I mean, we are operating with, right? We're at this kind of complex, very complex kind of situation where none of us can really claim that our knowledge is kind of best suited and comprehensive and, you know, good enough. We really can't. Each one of us has deep shortcomings in this, and we need to learn from the others. And the reason why I still believe in conducting extensive field work is because I want to learn more. Because it for me it's very it's very attractive to kind of sit and keep writing, but then you don't grow and then you don't add to your knowledge. And these are the things that you keep learning in various ways. I mean, we've done a lot of work in Bombay also with women, and how in terms of health and in terms of other kind of abuses that you were talking about, how space creates a certain kind of constraint in women, and how it kind of changes the so-called family dynamics that we and there are fascinating stories again in that space or from that space about how it puts how it even jeopardizes women's safety within the family or within the space of what we otherwise construe as very safe and very protected kind of space, but that actually opens up or threatens or becomes threatening to women in many ways. So yeah, so I mean there are so many stories we can keep talking about them forever.